Okay, well, hi everybody, and welcome to the Future Earth pop-up webinar series. My name is Jim O'Neill. With me today in the background is Lizzie Sayer. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Lizzie, from Future Earth. I will be presenting, as you probably well know, the Eye-Catching Science webinar. So Lizzie will be kind of acting as a bit of an advocate for all of you attendees, because once I start on my slides, I won't be able to see your questions and comments. So Lizzie's just going to interject with any of those that seem like they need addressing as we go through. And then she'll collect anything that's sort of not urgent, and then we'll address those questions and comments at the end. Okay, well, let's get into it. I'll start sharing my screen, if I can remember how to do that. Let's try this. Okay, here we go. You should be able to see my screen now. Okay, so I'm a graphic designer. I've been working as a creative professional for most of my professional career in a variety of ways. I've done a little bit of journalism before. I studied public relations initially and moved on from there to doing graphic design. I spent a long time working in graphic design agencies, sort of doing the technical side of graphic design before I moved out to sort of working with the kind of development and science aspects of this. So I've been working, building infographics for science organizations for the last few years, and when Future Earth approached me to put together a couple of webinars for this pop-up webinar series, I thought what might be handy is if we can talk about some of the free tools that are available for people who want to make infographics who aren't necessarily graphic designers. These tools aren't things that I necessarily use in my day-to-day practice, although some of them are. But they'll be extremely useful for anybody who's not necessarily a trained graphic designer, who can use all of the Adobe Creative Suite to put together enormous long infographics. Let's get into it. I just thought I'd have a couple of caveats before we begin. With your questions and comments, it'd be really great if we can just keep it nice and positive. As Michelle said in an earlier pop-up webinar, it's just nice to have a nice, safe learning space here. So there's that. What we'll be going through today are effectively my opinions of these tools. Now, I've done my best to go and investigate the tools and use them and kind of play with them, I guess, to see which ones kind of work. But what you'll be getting today is my opinion. It's just that, and your experience of these tools may vary. There's quite a wide variety of people, it seems, attending today's webinar. So I've tried to include things that are more basic and things that are more kind of advanced for someone who's got some statistical knowledge. Okay, well, let's begin, shall we? The first thing I want to talk about very briefly before moving on is what is the difference between an infographic and a data visualization? Is there a difference? So, I mean, we hear the terms thrown around all the time, and I think the reason why it might be nice to address this as we go forward here is that arguably there is a difference, although these Venn diagrams of the two do overlap. It's just a matter of trying to work out exactly how much they overlap. And the reason why that's useful is that, I mean, if you start talking to a graphic designer or a front-end developer to try and help you make your visualization or infographic, it's kind of handy that you're aware that there's sort of some debate about what's what, just so that you're asking for the right thing. So, I mean, actually, let's look at these two phrases for a start. So infographic is information graphic, and information is data, and a graphic is a visualization. So arguably the two terms are sort of fairly synonymous, but what you'll find if you dig around a little bit, and there's a reference that should pop up here at some point, is that there is arguably a difference between the two of them depending upon who you're talking to. So there's not actually a hard and fast definition of what's what. But what we tend to find is that an infographic tends to be slightly more editorialized version of the data. So it's something where you've investigated the data yourself and you've come up with a distinct set of points that, and takeaways that you want people to get from the data. And you present it in a way that kind of highlights those things specifically. The other thing about it is that data visualizations have a tendency to be slightly more complex in terms of the data they actually present, and possibly in the user experience of it. So you'll find that some of the more complicated data visualizations are these interactive ones where you can investigate the data yourself and kind of dig into it a little bit, and that allows you to establish your own takeout from the graphic. Now, my take on that particular thing is that actually anybody who's making these things tends to filter. So when you have a mass of data that you collect for a project, you're going to filter that data, and that in itself becomes a slight editorialization, and you're going to need to sort of slightly simplify that data in order to present it to people. So you are taking away some of that complexity immediately, irrespective of which method we use. The other thing about it is that depending upon who you talk to, a data visualization can be construed to be sort of maybe generative, which is to say that it's something that creates itself, or that you create from the data without necessarily too much kind of typing in the middle. So that if you replace the data visualization will sort of create itself again. So this is something that if you look at forums like reddit.com's data visualization versus infographics subreddits, this is a distinction that they make quite clearly there. If you wish to share things to those subreddits to help you publicize your information, you need to be aware that this exists. Okay, let's move on. So today I intended to talk about the kind of tools that are available to us, the free tools mostly that are available to us to help us visualize data. And the most important tool really is you and your brain. Before you start looking at the tools that you're going to use to make the infographic, it's incredibly important for you to sit down and plan the thing through. So if you don't have a solid plan, you won't necessarily know how to build it, what you're going to say, and to whom you wish to say it. So before we start doing any pixel pushing, we need to work out where does the graphic fit in your organization's communications and or social media strategy. So I guess we're talking a lot today about digital sharing. So that's not necessarily always the case. You might be building a visualization or an infographic that you might wish to print and put into a report, or an annual report or some other kind of article or brochure. But what's been happening over the past handful of years or more is that as the web is becoming more and more visually oriented, these things, as you probably well know, are becoming extremely important. So having a visual aspect to your information is a really important way to let people have access to it. So, and we need to work out who those people are. So it's really important with any type of communications, visual, written, or verbal, that you are aware of who your intended audience is, because that's going to change the things that we wish to say to them. And we'll talk about that in a little more depth later. So we also need to work out how we're going to get that message to those people. Are we going to be delivering it through Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, or is it going to be printed, or is it going into a presentation slide? And all of these things have different limitations and technical considerations that you need to be aware of. But one of the most important things that we need to think about before we begin is, what is the story that we're going to tell our audience? And as I said before, I think that irrespective of whether we're visualizing a large amount of data or a smaller simplified data set, that story is important. We need to know the things that we think we wish people to take away from it. So let's have a chat first about information, the tiered information strategy. So I borrowed this graphic, paraphrased it, I guess, in a manner of speaking from Michelle's previous presentation about how to tweet about science and sustainability. And it kind of talks about what I'm referring to as a tiered information strategy, so that You've got your sort of teaser content, which is simplified and bite-sized pieces of information, if you like, that are shared out onto these various social media channels. And that encourages people to kind of dig further into the content. So the idea there is we kind of hook people and we take them in a little bit further into storefront content, which may be videos or podcasts or photo sets. And ideally, the destination for people who become really engaged with that information that we share with them is your, your site or your key content, whatever you define that to be. Arguably behind that. Sorry, Lizzie?
Hi, Jim. Sorry to interrupt. Somebody's just noticed there's a little bit of interference when you're speaking. I don't know if you have keys or something next to your desk that makes a noise like jangling. But if there's anything you can do to take them away, that would be fantastic.
You know, I don't have any keys, but I am sitting on a really creaky chair, so it could be that, or it could actually be these headphones that I'm using might be kind of rattling around. I can try taking that out, but I'm sorry?
Better now. Sounds better now. I don't know if you've changed something, but it sounds cleaner now.
Oh, I'm sitting slightly differently. Well, let's keep an eye on it. I'm not sure exactly what changed there, but if it happens again, please interrupt me. No problem at all. I didn't mean to pause quite so long on this slide. It was supposed to be just a pass through to kind of to point out that the kind of scientific papers and more in-depth kind of data that you guys are generating is really what's behind that key content as well, but that we are kind of filtering that through this tiered strategy. Okay, so communications 101 really is who are we talking to? And I've noticed in my practice that often people kind of have that as a bit of an afterthought, but actually it's one of the most important things to consider. Here's an example of some numbers that somebody gave me to try and make an infographic with. As a graphic designer, this means very little to me, so I have to kind of go to Google and translate that. And we kind of translate it through a number of steps here. And I think we can gather as we go through this, and please forgive me if there's any errors in this. As we go through this, I think you can see that what I'm doing here is kind of simplifying and allowing the kind of underlying information to come out. And I think if you're a scientist, this bottom area probably makes sense. And as we go up through it, it comes to make more and more sense to me. And so I guess what we're doing here is we're kind of translating things for the novice, and that's a choice that you have to make. Who is it that you're referring to? I guess the messaging that you put into your infographic will probably change depending upon whether you're presenting at a conference or whether you're trying to get people on Instagram to like your photo and or connect with your deeper content. So I'll put a little asterisk there next to the word novice, because actually I want to point out that even something like 20 years worth of carbon emissions, and I know that there's a lot more context that's missing from that sentence, and this is just an example. That sentence still has a lot of assumed knowledge. And I think it's really easy when you've been studying in a field for a long time to kind of presume that everybody knows exactly what you're talking about. But even that sentence there, implicit in that is the idea that we understand why carbon emissions are important for the world. And that might not necessarily be obvious to some people. But as we go through here, if we go back down through the list, we're seeing that we're becoming slightly more complicated, and that means that is designed for an audience who's more knowledgeable on this topic, through to about there where I would for me personally, I would consider somebody to be more or less an expert on the topic, and that this one down here really is a bit of an outlier. Okay, so once you've established who you're talking to, you need to work out how you're going to talk to them, every medium or channel that you choose to deliver this information has its own limitations and its own technical considerations, which you need to be aware of before you start actually constructing the thing. And this is going to be true whether or not you're building the graphic yourself, or if you're getting a graphic designer or a front-end developer to help you build this. For example, Instagram, you need to be aware that most people view this stuff on their cell phone. And that is quite a small thing. So you can't necessarily cram a whole lot of information in there. And you're probably talking about a single factoid put over the top of a nice photo. But then if you decide to build it for that medium and then you wish to share it on Twitter, there's another technical limitation that comes into play here, which is that Instagram doesn't play nicely with Twitter, and you don't get a preview in the timeline, which is not the ideal scenario for that. And then on Facebook, if you have lots of text in your image, it won't let you boost your posts because it seems to think that you're trying to advertise something. I'm not sure exactly why that happens, but that's what they do. And so there's all these limitations. And really the point I'm making here is that whichever medium you choose to deliver the message has its own limitations, including your own blog or your own website will have things that it will do more easily or less easily. And you need to be aware of what those are before beginning. That's the main point. Okay. All right, so let's get into the crux of this. What is the story that you wish to tell your audience? So I'm going to borrow this content from a webinar that the folks on Think Tanks put on, which involved a representative from Infogram, which is a service that we're going to talk about later, a free service for building infographics. And they've borrowed some content from the Heath Brothers book called Made to Stick. And it has a nice acronym which kind of really outlines what makes a good story. So they've got an acronym which is SUCCESS, which is your keys to success. And so what you're going to do is tell people a simple, unexpected, credible, concrete, emotional story. And in that book, I guess they go into greater detail about what they mean under each of these sections. Personally, I'd like to add a second S to the end of this here, because I really wanted to spell success properly for a start. But also I think it's really important to bring this up. Structured, so you need a structured story as well. And what I mean by that is that it needs to be clearly laid out, which I guess they're probably covering the idea of simple, but I just want to bring it up again. It's clearly laid out in a stepwise fashion to bring people into the information. And also that it's legible, so that the structure itself allows people to understand the data or the information that you're presenting. Okay, a couple of key points here. When we say simple, we're not necessarily talking about dumbing the data down. So it's really just about how you take this information that you've got and make it understandable. Whether or not you're layering that information using some graphic tricks, which we'll talk about in the follow-up webinar. But the ideal thing is that you're really true to your data. So unexpected. And this is the kind of thing, that these clickbait titles, what happens next, makes you click. Please don't use that. But in the unexpected, they talk about these things, these curiosity gaps, where you ask or pose a question to somebody that makes them think, oh yeah, actually, I've never thought about that. I wonder what the answer to that question is, and they'll investigate. Credible, and there's a bunch of ways to establish credibility, but really for us, I think it's about making sure that that we source the data that we're using, so that if people really kind of like, I wonder where this came from, that they can track that down. Concrete. My takeout from the word concrete in this acronym really is, I mean, as we saw in that figure before, we have a margin of error in lots of science, and that's the nature of it. The sad fact is that most people really probably don't understand exactly what that means, and that we need to kind of, I'm not saying that you don't use that margin of error, because it is actually part of the set, really. But it's up to you kind of how you make this more or less concrete. And what you'll see often is that people use things like as much as if they want to talk about the upper limit. Now, arguably that sensationalizes the figure, so perhaps you don't want to do that, or up to. A word that I have a problem with is significant, because that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so if you're starting to say things like a significant change in X, then we really need to ask ourselves, what is that significance? How am I going to make that significant for my audience? So emotional is, why do people care about it? So remember who your audience is, and remember the things that they're going to care about. So as I said, even the most complicated visualizations, if they're going to be functional, some visualizations are made just to be beautiful, which is fine, but really they don't tell the story. And so you need to make sure that they're logical and legible. Here's something I like to refer to as the principle of equivalency. So often we're talking about numbers that can be so mind-bogglingly large that they actually cease to mean too much to most people. And I guess this is why you often see things like people say, you know, so many swimming pools worth of water, or so many football fields worth of rainforests were destroyed or regrown, or that kind of thing. So when you're trying to structure the story in your data and you've got your key points outlined, try and work out a way to make it relatable. So I'm going to show you an example here. This is an advertising example actually for some kind of share trading software. But that's not the point. The point is that this example really brings home the point that they're trying to make to people. So let me get it up for a second. Okay, so this is how the infographic starts. And it asks me, what is my salary? And this is their way of actually making the next figures really relatable to me as a person. So let's just put something in there randomly. What's a good figure? Let's call it this. Let's type that in. Now they're using an example of a person called John Paulson, who I'm not familiar with, but they're saying it takes 2.7 minutes for this person to make my annual income. And as we scroll down, we've got some other figures here. It would take me 196,000 years in this example to earn the same as this person. In the time we've been here, this person's made this much money. And give the things you could buy with. And these are some of the things that we could make with that much money. So the idea is that they've got this data, and then in the way that they've visualized this, they've really made this tailored to me, to my interests, and it makes it relatable to me as a person. So these massive figures that this person earns suddenly come to make a great deal more sense to me. This is a great one. John dropping $400,000 is the equivalent of me buying a donut. I just think that's a really powerful equivalency right there. Okay, let's go back. What am I doing for time here? Bear with me while I have a quick look at my clock. Okay. So as part of my practice, and I'm pretty sure almost every graphic designer will work the same way, it's one of the first stages is research, which is to say that you go and you look at what other people have done. There's no point trying to reinvent the wheel. If somebody else has spent days and days thinking of a solution to a problem that's quite similar to yours, why not look at that thinking and see how you can adapt it? So I've included just a couple of examples here, some of the more famous examples going around of infographics. Let's look at this one, Charles Minard's map. This is probably one of the more famous infographics. And as we can see down here, it was drawn by hand in 1869. And it looks like an extremely complicated graphic when you first look at it. But it's actually fairly simple, really, for the amount of information that we're presenting here. So this is, this is an English translation that somebody called Inago Lopez has done, and they've also included a couple of translations here so that we have some Celsius figures down here. What we have is Napoleon's march to Moscow, and as the army marches out, the width of the line here is the size of the army as it goes, and as it progresses from left to right, we see some things happening. A few people split off here, a few people split off here to go and do different things, and as we go, we can see the line just keeps getting thinner and thinner. And then the black line represents the army's march back, and we can see again getting thinner and thinner. And on the return march, we can scan down here and have a look and see the temperature gradient that those people had to face as they marched. So it's really quite a lot of information. You have geographical information here, which is obviously very stylized and very simplified. He's decided that we don't need to necessarily have all of the geographical information. We don't need to see the mountains. The rivers, I guess, as we can see here, are posing a significant obstacle to the army, and so he's decided to include that information. So that, one of the most famous infographics, was drawn in 1869. Let's talk about this one. Now, this is an interactive visualization. Now, some of these examples that I'm showing you are quite complicated and have been built by, with a lot of budget, which we don't always necessarily have for our visualizations and infographics. But that doesn't mean we can't look at them and borrow some of the thinking for our own stuff. And I think the most powerful thing about this really is the headline: which companies caused global warming? And it allows us to dig into this. This is, as I was saying before, this is what some people would technically consider a data visualization, but it is editorialized. So we can think here, state-owned. What does that do? So we click on that and it expands out, gives us information inside, and we can go back. So I'm not going to spend too long investigating these examples. I'm hoping that if you're interested in them, you'll borrow the links and go and investigate them for yourself. Lewis Felton is one of my favorite infographic designers. He's famous because he keeps data that tracks his entire life, and he makes an annual report of his life every year, and he has done so for a number of years. Let's go have a look at that, his website. The example in my presentation is from his 2012 report, and you can buy these, and they're actually quite collectible. And one of the things that I really like about his approach is really the visual treatment. Just look at the amount of space that he leaves around all of this information here. Oftentimes when, if you're a bit of a novice at designing, you tend to have a tendency to want to make things as big as possible. And arguably graphic designers go the other direction where they try and make things as small as they can get away with. And that's not always the best way to go. But this space here, which again, as practical design tips, we'll hopefully talk about in a little more depth in the follow-up webinar. But that's a really important thing. And also his usage of color is really quite stunning. He's one of my favorite kind of animated infographics. And I hesitate to pronounce this name because I can't speak German, so please forgive me. I just want to watch, if you'll indulge me, a minute or so of this infographic. And what I really like about this animated, I'm calling it an animated infographic, is that it not only does it have an extremely complex thing that it represents simply, but this will talk us through stepwise the decisions they made to simplify that data. And that's one of the important lessons that I want you guys to take away from this. So let's have a look. Hopefully it'll, here it is. I'll just go full screen with this.
Every second of your life, you are under attack.
I'm wondering if you can hear my audio.
Viruses and fungi are trying to make you their home. Still, our bodies have developed a super complex little army with guards, soldiers, intelligence, weapons factories, and communicators to protect you from, well, dying. For this video, let's assume the immune system has 12 different jobs. For example, kill enemies, communicate, etc. And it has 21 different cells and 2 protein forces. These cells have up to 4 different jobs. Let's assign them. Here are the interactions. Now, let's make this understandable. First of all, let's add colors to the jobs. Now, let's illustrate the cells. The central color represents the main job of the cell, while the surrounding ones represent secondary duties. Now, the immune system looks like this. Now, the interactions. Isn't this complexity just awesome? For this video, we will only talk about these cells and ignore the rest.
So what I like about that is that they really outline the fact that there is a lot more information behind this topic than we're going to address at this point in time. But without actually confusing us necessarily. They kind of say, look at this mind-boggling complexity, and here's how we're going to simplify it. And then that uses this simplified set as a representative of the whole. And I really like that about how they've approached that. All right, let's get into some actual physical tools. So you've got a data set, and in order to work out exactly what it's telling you or the important things about it, if you are not necessarily statistically minded and gifted using packages like R, it can be really handy to be able to explore your set. And there's a couple of tools that I've come across while I was trying to build this webinar that I think are really handy. So let's have a quick look at those. The first one I want to talk about is IBM Watson Analytics. Now, both of these tools that I'm going to talk about are free, but in fact, almost all of the tools that we'll be talking about today are kind of freemium, which is to say that they give you a certain set of tools that are free. And if you wish to unlock the rest of them, well, then you need to pay. But this does have some really good free tools. So let me get out of that. Let's have a look in here. So I've just made myself an account and logged in, and I've actually uploaded a couple of little test data sets here. And this is one of their example sets, this bike sharing set here. And obviously being their data set, it's set up in a way that talks to their system perfectly. So this is probably an ideal case for this tool, but it's a wonderful illustration of how this works. So if we click on that, it tells me ask a question. Now, what I really like about this tool is that it allows me to actually interrogate the data set in plain English. So I don't necessarily need to be able to speak fluent statistics in order to get something out of this. So we can say something like, and I've seen this data set. Let's have a quick look at it. And there's all these different headings here. So we have riders, seasons, months, weather. So let's go back here. Let's ask this data set a question. What is the relationship? Say wind, because I know that that's the figure that they tracked. And riders by month. Enter. And then it'll try and interpret what I've said. And obviously, depending on how you phrase that question, it's going to be more or less successful. Anyway, right here, oh, look, very relevant. What is the relationship between riders and wind by month? So let's click on that and see what happens. So it's building it now. Okay, so it's plotted the sum of the wind figures and the riders for, if I can get this collection out of the way, by month. And I think we can sort of see a reasonable correlation there between, it's probably quite light actually when the wind is high. The riders are low. There's a couple of outlier months here, and maybe that's something that's like, why are these there? So maybe you'd want to investigate that, try and work out what are the factors that really push these. Oh, sorry, that's a wind. Yeah, but what pushed those out of this kind of correlation? Okay, so that's that tool. Let's have a look at the next one. So it's free to try, allows you to interrogate the data, and it's easy for data rookies like me to be able to discover trends and relationship in data. But you will need to make sure you've got nice, clean, organized data. Now, this does have an infographic and what they call a dashboard creation function, which is to say that when you make a visualization, like the one you just saw me create, that you can put a few of those together and make a dashboard that you can then host on a website and people can investigate them themselves. Now, in my opinion, the way this actually is implemented is a little clunky. I mean, there is quite a steep learning curve into how to produce these things, and the same with the next tool. So Tableau Public is the next one that I want to talk about. Tableau is quite a powerful statistical kind of visualization package. Tableau Public is the free version of it. It runs off a desktop app, which it lets you download for free for Mac and Windows. It has some pretty powerful data analysis and exploration features that are, quite frankly, beyond me for the most part. So there's a bit of a learning curve, but there is a relatively intuitive drag and drop interface, which I quite like. Once again, it does have quite powerful sharing kind of features of these visualizations that you can create using maps and all kinds of different chart methodologies, but you will need to kind of look at some tutorials if you want to use this to visualize your data for consumption by your target audience. So let's have a look at it, Tableau Public. So I had some dummy data, which I'll be using in a few of the kind of charts that we generated today. I just had that generated randomly on a website. And it has a few dimensions through here. So it's looking at, we have country. Now let's go back. This is our data source. And we can make a new sheet. Okay, so this is it, a blank slate. But over here we have a bunch of options. And as we kind of hover over it, it's trying to give me a little tip here. These are the sorts of things we might want to look at to create this type of visualization. I click on country. The two map ones become active. So let's look at filled maps, which are choropleth or heat maps in this instance. I can click on that. And it's a bit flat because we've only given it country. So it's just highlighting the countries for which we have data in this set. So let's throw annual income into color. Oh, look at that. Suddenly we see some dimension in the data. We can go through here, change that to say average. Yeah, gets a bit softer there. But down in here, if I wish to, I can change what the colors represent. So let's make it a little more dramatic. A bit of orange. Let's go advanced. We can change the start and midpoints of that color with relation to the data. So I'll be using a lot of maps, I think, in this demonstration because I think they're quite, it's sometimes quite difficult to generate if you don't have a dedicated GIS team that can give you the right coordinates, etc., etc. But most of the tools that I'll be showing you today have the ability to translate something as simple as a country name into a location just like this. And there's sorry, Lizzie?
Hi, Jim. I have a question from Milena about Tableau Public, who wonders if your data has to be made public as well to use the tool.
Yes. Well, that's one of the limitations for this. I think if you have a paid version, you can keep things private, but the data set that you throw into this will be public. But really, that's actually going to be the case for most of the free tools. I mean, there are exceptions to that, but really what I'm talking about here is how we're making things available to an audience, and we're really going to need to make a lot of that data public. If you wish to make things a little more private, well, it makes things slightly more complicated, and maybe you have to choose one of these things and upgrade your plan to one of the kind of paid models. And that's an unfortunate limitation, but I guess, you know, as companies are making these tools, often they have to impose these limitations so they can make some cash. Do we feel like that answers the question, Lizzie?
I think so. Thanks, Tim.
No problem. All right, so there's a lot more in this, and as I said, being a bit of a kind of rookie when it comes to really massive data sets, I'm not going to dive too much into it, but this, if you're someone who's a little bit more comfortable with playing with your statistics a little bit, it's definitely worth investigating. It's quite a powerful tool. Okay, moving right along. Let's talk about the tools for actually constructing it. So you've gone through this whole process and you're actually ready now to start building your infographic. How are we going to do that? And here's a few tools that I've found. The first one I want to talk about is a slight sort of outlier, but it's actually really quite a lovely tool. It's a totally free tool developed by Nightlab, which is an educational, part of an educational institution. And what it does in essence is it gives you a gives you a Google Sheets template that you fill out with data, and then it generates this quite lovely interactive timeline. Let's have a look at that. Here's one I prepared earlier. Okay, so I've just kind of gone through and populated this with some information about me to kind of make a CV, and I've got it to play in reverse order so that the timeline starts at the end and goes backwards. Now this is all sort of interactive, so there's a whole lot of stuff going on here, and we can zoom this timeline in, we can pan it along, or we can just click through it and it'll take us back like this. So as we go through this, actually, let me backstep. I've taken a few of these examples here, and because I think that one of the really wonderful aspects of lots of these free tools is how it generates shareable, often interactive, often responsive charts and visualizations that you can embed into your own blog posts. I've gone ahead and just on my folio site, I've made a little hidden page here, which you can see here. And feel free to take that URL and type it in and go and have a play with the things that I'll be talking about. As an example for how these might look on your blog. Now, there's a few kind of, as we'll see, there's a few kind of technical things about that. You probably need to understand a little bit about HTML, how to embed that into your blog post. But I'm hoping that some, if not all of you, have access to somebody who can help you with that, perhaps an IT department or somebody who's helped you build your website, or maybe you could Google through some some tutorials, because I'm sure that there's a vast array of different blog implementations out there in the attendee land with you guys, and I'm quite frankly not necessarily au fait with how to do all that, but this is how it worked for me. Okay, now let's investigate this a little further. Okay, so timeline.nightlab.com. Easy to make beautiful timelines. I think they're true to their word. And it's got a step-by-step process here, which is build a new Google spreadsheet using a template, which they give you. If you've got a Google account, you go to that template. There's a tiny little button, which is a little bit hidden, that allows you to use that template. And then you populate that with your data. And here's what the data for my little thing would look like. So it's got a whole lot of headings up here, as we can see. And what this tool does, basically, is when we're done here, we copy this URL, and it tells us how to do this. After we've published it to the web, paste that URL in here, and then it creates this code. And this is the code I was talking about, which allows me to embed it. But we can also preview it. So let's just copy that. Let's go back here, pasting that in here. And if I preview it, you can see here that it's playing forwards. And I wouldn't mind to play backwards, but there's a few different options. Optional settings. So we have language. Start at the end was the selection that I clicked. And there's a few other options there which you can investigate. Preview that. And now it's starting at the end like I wanted it to. Okay, so I found that, I mean, the headings in the sheet, you know, don't necessarily make a great deal of sense initially because you're not sure exactly how that translates visually. But it's easy to play with. I mean, I can go back into this thing here, into my data, make a change, come back here, and hit the preview button again, and it will redraw based on the new data because this is automatically saved and published every time I make a change to it. And so this tool is able to read that data straight away. Okay, so the next few tools we're going to talk about, I guess, are the kind of what people think about when we talk about making free tools for making infographics. And these things are kind of designed to make those long form infographics that you see shared in places like Pinterest and in fact some of which I've built myself, which are those things that come up and, you know, they're quite long and you scroll through and read the information as you go. So Infogram, I guess, is probably, in my opinion, one of the more simple ones, but it's simple to use. It's also simple in its application. So I've made a free account, as you can see here. I've signed in and I've made a test infographic, which I will show you how it appears on my website in a minute. Coming into the interface, we've got a whole lot of different options here. We can add a chart, we can add a map, we can add some text, add a picture, add, you know, link to media. And most of these tools have, some of them have free images, free icons. Most of them, in fact, have free images and icons that you can add to your infographic, or you can add your own images, which is quite important. So here's a map that I added. And if we double click on that, we get access to the data. So I think that out of the free tools that we've got here, that Infogram has one of the more simple and easy to use mapping features. And it does come up with chloropleth or heat mapping, which is quite important, I think, for representing data. And one of the other ones I will show you doesn't actually do that, which is a little odd. Okay, let's close that. Wait, let's go back actually really quickly. The other thing about Infogram is it links to a whole lot of different data sources. And yes, your data will probably have to be public. Otherwise, this tool won't be able to go and read it. So it can connect to Google Drive, to Dropbox. We can upload a file and it tells me the formats. And in fact, this one allows us to link to a live data feed if you're technical enough to do that. Nope, that's not what I wanted to do at all. So how it looks when we add something, let's just try adding a chart, say an area chart. Okay, so it's automatically extended the bottom of this infographic and put in a new chart there, and it's populated it with some dummy data. And that dummy data is actually really handy because it shows us exactly what the chart is expecting in terms of data and how it will draw, based on what we've got. These things have a lot of settings so that we can go and change all of the colors. We can change the chart height if we want to make it a little more dramatic there, and a whole lot of other options. Let's have a look how that looked when I embedded it. So from here, I've made my infographic and I can share it. And it gives me a lot of links. So if I just want to send somebody a link to this and they can come and view it on the Infogram website, there's that link. But one of the more powerful things that we have is this embed link here, which is what I've taken to embed. What you'll see is an interactive version of this infographic on my site. Now, really what would be handy would be if we could download it. One of the limitations for a free account using Infogram is that they block the downloading. So they're asking you to pay in order to get access to that ability to download. So if you wanted to make a simple infographic and download it as, say, a JPEG or a PNG to throw into your PowerPoint presentation, it's trying to prevent us from doing that. But it does let us embed it. So where are we? Let's have a look. So I think one of the good things about this is if you do have the ability to embed these graphics, I mean, you could either have them as a standalone infographic, or perhaps you could even just make the one map, the one chart, and just use it in line as part of your blog post as you're explaining something. And it's interactive, which is great. So we can zoom the map in and, have a look at the actual values that are being presented for each of those countries. And here's a little donut chart with the automatically generated data. And look, it's interactive. We can go through and check out the time series. And as this data changes through time, if we're confused as to which value is which, we can highlight it just by hovering. And same with that. So, kind of getting close on time, aren't I, Lizzie? Okay, let's just keep going. Venngage is very similar. Let's have a look at it. Here's my little test infographic. Well, look, another one, exporting is not available, but sharing is. So I've published it. I have my embed code, and I've embedded it into here. Once again, you can see by hovering on some of the areas that we have some interactive features which tell us values and allow us to interact a little bit with the data. So Venngage does have a mapping tool, and it will let me do chloropleth heat mapping, but most of the maps that are available are kind of, you have to pay for. You have to be on a paid account to use them, and there's only a very limited number that aren't. Okay, let's move right along. Pictochart, yet again, very similar tool. Oh, I'm not logged in. Is it going to log me straight in? That'd be handy. Yep. I am already signed in. Let's have a look at my saved Pictocharts, and here's the very quick example that I made. And so most of these have a kind of template, and that's the beauty of it. I guess they try and take away some of the design decisions that you have to make by giving you a kind of what they consider to be a well-designed template to start with, so that you don't necessarily have to do lots of thinking about colors and sizes and things like that. And that is handy. Let's have a look here at the download options. Okay, so Pictochart does let us download a small size or a medium size, but if I want a high-res one that I can use for printing or a PDF for professional quality, it's going to ask me to pay. But I do have the ability to download a smaller one if I wish to embed it somewhere. Let's go and have a look here. So one of the things that I want to bring up about Pictochart's limitations, specifically referring to the mapping, is that it does have this kind of interactive map that if you wish to embed it, the user can investigate and hover over and see the values, but it doesn't let me do heat mapping unless I manually assign the colors for those regions, which I think is a little limited. Anyway, let's have a look. Let's just investigate some of the shapes and lines and icons and things. So, you know, it's going to ask me to select a block. That's how this particular one works. And there we go. I've added this. I can change the fill color. Let's make it white. Yeah. So this. Close the icons. Let's have a look at photos. So it's got some photos we can use if we don't have our own to use, which may or may not be handy. Or you can include a photo frame, which is, I guess, its way of saying that you can crop something into a circle or a different shape. And once again, you can upload your own images, which I'll talk about. I'm just going to skip through these, and hopefully, if you're curious, you can go and investigate these in your own time. So Visme is another sort of simplified infographic creation tool, and let's have a look at what it gave me. Well, here's PictoCharts, and you can see that it's allowing me to see the underlying data on hover with a tooltip, but didn't let me draw it. PictoChart, when you share it here, is a static version, but from memory, I think that PictoChart lets me download a little more easily. So this is a bit of a whirlwind tour. I'm aware that I'm moving quite quickly through these tools, but there is actually quite a plethora of different tools out there, and I was kind of hoping that what we do is just take a really quick tour through them now, give you a bit of an overview of perhaps what they might be useful for, and then when you come to make your own infographic, maybe you can go through and make your own assessment as to which one provides the best set of tools for what you need. Okay, Canva. Canva is a tool that's not really necessarily designed for making those long form infographics that we talked about. It does have the ability to do that inside it, but it's a little clunky. And it doesn't necessarily give me options. So for example, in Canva, if I wish to place a chart, I only get to use the kind of graphics, static graphic charts that they've made, and I can't even change the values. So they're only really useful for doing representative figures. But what it is useful for is creating things like Instagram posts or Facebook covers or other social media posts. So if you wanted to do something simple like, I don't know, post to Instagram and maybe have a single chart or a single factoid over the top of it, perhaps what you can do is make a chart either in here, or maybe you just want to present a fact like X% of people did something, and then put it into one of these posts. Let's have a look at how they look anyway. So once again, I have templates that I can choose from. Let's just choose a different one randomly. It gives us the ability to kind of filter up our images if that's something you wish to do. You can edit text. We can reposition it. It's got a nice little handy guide there that pops up to help me align things, which some of them actually don't have, and I think it's quite important. Okay. What are we doing here? It allows me to upload my own images if I wish to. I'll pop them into a container like that. I wonder if it'll let me do that like that. That's pretty easy. Actually, let's say we wanted to put another desk photo. We could search for desk. Now, Canva does have most of its features available for free. The one thing that it does do is that content, specific content, so some of these images, some of the icons, some of the charts, etc., are kind of premium content, and you can build your graphic using any of that content, and as soon as you export it or you go to share it, it will ask you to pay for it then. And it's quite reasonable. It's only a few dollars or maybe $1 per item. But yeah, it is free to a point. Okay. Talk about icons. So lots of the tools have icons that that are free to use, that are from inside the system. But actually making good icons, making icons that represent, have the kind of nice visual metaphors for your ideas, it can be quite difficult. And the kind of stock icons don't necessarily always cut it. There's a really useful tool I came across called Icon Finder. And let's have a look at it anyway before I talk too much more about it. So Icon Finder is, once again, freemium. We can search for icons. Let's look for, I don't know, let's have a look for forest. See what it comes up with. Okay, so we have some icons here. Now, I've actually only searched for free ones. And they are free, but they're kind of under a, oh my gosh, what's the term? Creative Commons license. Apologies. So some of them have an attribution. So if you're using it for commercial purposes, you probably need to credit the creator. So those aren't too great. Maybe we could just look for tree. Oh, there's a nice little tree. There's another nice little tree, and it has access to different methods here. So we have 26 by 26 pixel icon. This one's 30 by 30. So they have different sizes that are available depending upon the icon. So a bunch of the icons that I use in this presentation, those social media icons before, I got from Icon Finder, and I think they were really nice. As well as the brain icon that I used earlier, that was also from Icon Finder. So yeah, that's just another tool. And what you would do is export that PNG from Icon Finder and then upload it into your chosen tool and then place it into your layout. Okay, what about if we don't want to make a really long infographic? We just want to make a chart. Well, there's a few tools for that too. Okay, I'm almost out of time. I have a few more things to talk about, but we're not going too badly. I hope you'll bear with me if we go 5 minutes over. Plotly lets you make charts. I mean, sure, you can make charts in Excel, in Keynote, and even in, I guess, PowerPoint. Plotly, out of the tools that I'm going to show you, is probably the most technical. How do I get to my... Let's just have a look at some stuff that other people have made. I didn't have a great deal of luck actually making a really attractive graphic with Plotly. Out of the tools that I'm going to show you, I guess this one looks the most kind of sciencey in that it looks a little bit more like the sorts of things that you'd expect to see in science publications, which kind of look a little bit more like Excel. It is actually possible, and if you go through some of these examples, you'll see some quite nicely styled charts. But I guess one of the reasons I wanted to show you this tool is that out of the free ones, this one does have a little bit more access to some statistical features, so that if you're a little bit more advanced in terms of your stats knowledge and ability, then perhaps this might be the tool for you to visualize something slightly more complicated. And how that looks in place when it's shared is not present. Okay. Let's talk about chart blocks. Chart blocks I really like. I only found this a couple of days ago, or maybe a week ago. It's quite a simple chart development tool, but I actually really like it. So this is a chart that I made just using some of their data. So by clicking on that, hopefully it's going to show me different chart types that are available to me. Let's just change that even. You have different options. Oh, let's make it horizontal. Okay. So here's the data. I can change it. As you can see, though, it's going to need some fairly simple data in here. Okay, so once I get to the point where I'm happy with it, let's maybe change that back to a donut chart. Let's have a look at the options. I only want to show half this donut chart because I'm going to make something that looks like an election chart. There we go. Let's save those changes. And that's what that looks like. It also has a nice little tooltip on hover that allows me to explore a little further what those values are if I'm not just interested in the relationship between them. Believe it or not, using Google Sheets is actually a really easy way to get hold of some reasonably nice looking charts that, if you like, will embed in an interactive fashion. Let's have a look at those. Okay, so here's that mock data I was referring to before, which I had generated just randomly, and it's got some country figures. Right now we're showing a filter. Clear that. No, we're not. Let's just show a few of them. So we've got some country data. We've got some randomly generated income. These don't relate to anybody in real life. And what I've done here is we've created a pivot table that collects all the different values and averages them by country. So here's a little chart that we've made. Right now, this chart's just showing Africa. So this actually has some mapping ability as well, which I think is quite good. Let's have a look at our options anyway. So we can actually change the chart type if we like to something more traditional. Pie, donut, they're all in there. Or a heat map. We can show, using this particular tool, different regions and highlight them, which I think is very handy. Or we can show the whole world. So we've made our chart, and there's a few different ways that we can get access to this chart. If we wish to embed it in a blog, what we would do is publish the chart. And once again, you need to be aware that your data is going to be public. So don't go putting any sensitive data into here if you wish to share it with people. Now we can either give people a link here, or we can embed it. And this provides me with that iframe code that we were talking about before, which I would then embed into my website. We have options for getting it out of here as well. So we can save the image. And I will tell you that coming from Google Sheets, it doesn't give you the biggest image when you save it like this. Actually, it can be a little small. It's probably fine for an on-screen presentation, or for if you just wanted to put that static PNG into your blog post or something like that. But if you wish to print it, it's probably a little small. But there's a little workaround we can do, and I'm not sure if this applies to other browsers, but in Chrome, if not using the shortcut key, we just go up to File and Print. It'll print this sheet. And actually what we have access to then, because I can save it as a PDF, which is in my destination choice, and it'll actually save out a vector version of this, which, if you know what I'm talking about, is very handy. It means it's completely scalable inside that PDF. So if you've got a way that you can import a PDF into your presentation or into your publication, there you go. You've got something you can kind of blow up to all different sizes, which I think is very handy. Well, let's have a look at how this embedded, because I think that that's really worth looking at. So back to my little website, and here's a chart as it looks when it's embedded. So as we can see, it's interactive, so we can hover over, get access to these values. This particular country, Greenland, doesn't have any data, but the others do. What about charts that aren't maps? All right, here's a donut chart, which I've just created some crazy dummy data for. And yeah, it embeds like that. Very handy. Moving on. Raw is a little tool that I found, which is probably, once again, a little more advanced in terms of the charts that you have access to. And what this particular one does is it draws charts in JavaScript library called D3, which stands for data-driven documents. And lots of those interactive visualizations that you see these days are created using this particular coding library. In fact, the Guardian one that we looked at before uses D3. Now, this makes charts that are static, but using that particular library. So let's just have a look here at how this works. They've got some sample data. Let's look at this one. So it's giving me some information about cocktails, which contain a certain amount of ingredients. Now, the one thing I like about this is that, I mean, all the other ones have your standard kind of line and area and donut, pie charts and histograms, etc. And this one gives us access to a few more kind of slightly weirder looking ones. But depending on the data that you have, these actually might be very handy. We have some hierarchical structures that we have access to. So a few weeks ago, I saw there was you may have seen an image go viral that was kind of a taxonomic kind of circle diagram that kind of tried to show all the different relationships between different taxonomical classifications. And it uses something similar to this one here. Let's go and investigate that right now. Now this is probably going to look a bit strange, but we're going to style it. Let's have a look at, let's do this. Just drag that under there. Okay. So we have this circular diagram here. It starts out and it shows the first variable that we chose, how that splits off into its ingredients, and then numerically presented are the different parts there. And so there's a few different options here that we can do. And the one that I actually built and embedded was this one. Let's have a look here. Let's have a look how to get it out first before we go and look at the one I used. So what this does is it actually makes an SVG. And that stands for Scalable Vector Graphic. And SVGs are becoming more and more popular in web applications, purely because they're scalable. And so as the web moves to kind of more and more responsive design, these things are able to be scaled up and down without any great loss of quality. So you don't need to kind of think about, oh, okay, so I need to make 5 different images at 5 different pixel dimensions so that they can render properly on everybody's different browsers. We just have the one here that we scale up and down. And so that makes it a little tricky for average everyday human beings like you and I to get the thing out and embed it. But let's have a look here. So if you like, you can export it as the SVG, you can export it as an image and a JSON data model, which frankly, I don't really understand. But what I did was embedded this SVG code here into my blog. And this is the diagram that I chose to render for it. And so we have the cocktails on the left here and the ingredients on the right. And as the lines go from left to right here, the width of it is the kind of relative parts figure. So, you know, it's not numerical, but as a visual representation of it, it's quite good. Okay, this is the last tool that I want to talk about, CartoDB, and it's once again probably a slightly more advanced tool, but it is actually an extremely powerful tool. And while it does have some learning curve, it's certainly not the easiest tool to use. But let's go and have a look at it. All right, so I've logged in, I've got a free account, and I've got some mock data here of some geographical mentions of stuff. And this is how it looks. And you have these different options here. So actually, first what we'll do, we'll have a look at the data. So when you upload the data to this, one of the good things about CartoDB is that it'll go through and it'll find words that it understands. You know, as I said earlier, some of the GIS mapping features can be quite technical. So if you don't have GPS coordinates or longitude, latitude coordinates for your data, or if you don't have kind of specific country shape information can be a little difficult if you're not using one of those other tools we showed you to visualize it. But this is great because it'll look at your data and say, you know what, I think that is referring to a geographical area, which is exactly what happened with this data when I uploaded it. It looked at this and said, yeah, I think that Botswana is a country and I know where it is. This particular figure, it doesn't know what that means. And so look a little false here, and this data is not being rendered on the map. Anyway, let's have a look at the map. It allows you to do a bunch of different things with styling. We've got little wizards here, so we can change how it renders it. And these options will change depending on the data that you've got available to you. And a quick look at how this looked on my website was like this. So actually it's sort of interactive. We can zoom around, we can pan. Back here, we can change some of these features that are available to the user. We can turn some of these things on and off, which I think is extremely handy. One of the things that I'd implore you to do if you're interested in this is that CartoDB has quite a wonderful, if you have time series in your data, there's actually an animated feature. Now, this data doesn't have time associated with it, so I can't preview that for you. But if you do and you wish to kind of look at the different tutorials that are available for you, you can make some really beautiful animated maps. And I think if anybody saw, I think last year or the year before, there was a map of Twitter mentions around maybe Soccer World Cup time that came out with it sort of animated, and it showed you kind of what happened when on Twitter when someone scored a goal, and you kind of see these heat points come up all over the world, and then they kind of calm down again. And that's I think that particular map that was actually built with CartoDB. All right, so let's bring this up to a close in the presentation, but I just wanted to mention before we go on that I've shown you a ton of different tools here, and one thing that's important to remember is that you can mix and match them. So for example, we can go to chart blocks, make ourselves a single nice chart, get ourselves a PNG or download that out, put that into Canva over the top of an image that we upload, for example, and we can make ourselves a nice Instagram post. For example, we could do the same thing with sheets, make ourselves a chart, export it as a PNG, upload that either to Flickr or to the back end of your website, and then in that timeline builder that I showed you before, we could paste a link to that, and then that would appear in our timeline. I just want to do one more thing really quickly before we get right to the tail end of this presentation. So I've said the word responsive design, responsive web design here in this presentation a couple of times, and I'm aware that maybe not everybody knows what that means. In essence, what that's referring to is having the same content on our website that is able to be repurposed for, if the screen, for example, on a tablet is smaller, it'll redraw and rearrange itself configured for that screen, and same thing in a cell phone or a smartphone. And some of the tools that I've shown you today have responsive features, and some of them don't. And depending on, it's up to you basically whether or not you want that responsive feature or whether you need that responsive feature. Where possible, it's extremely handy to have. And a lot of you probably will have web platforms that are built in a responsive fashion. But let's go and have a look at some of these tools that I've shown you today on my little testing site here. And we can see which ones are and aren't purely by, if I bring that over, as I expand this out, you can see that this redraws. The CartoDB map is getting bigger and smaller because it sees that my browser window is narrowing and it's redrawing itself to accommodate. But the one above it, which is my pretty ugly chart that I managed to cobble together in Plotly, isn't responsive. And so as the browser window comes in, it closes off the end of it. And so what that's going to force the user to do in your sites is scroll sideways. And if they're not aware they have to, they might miss it. Let's have a look at these two here. So chart blocks is not being responsive for me. The Google charts aren't responsive either, which is a little surprising given the fact that they're Google. There are some workarounds if you have an IT person you can talk to help you embed these graphics into your blog posts. there are apparently some workarounds, but they involve a little bit of sort of tricky coding that you need to change a few things in that frame embed code that we saw before. So it is possible. I didn't do it for this presentation because I wanted to show you exactly that there's this difference. And a few of these other ones are. In the raw one, that's not responsive because I haven't put it into a container that allows it to scale up and down. But let's have a look here. Okay, the PictoChart one seems to be scaling. Oh, my apologies, that's Visme. PictoCharts doesn't seem to be scaling. Venngage, look at that, it's scaled right down for us. So if this was our most extreme example here, single column, this is kind of replicating in the way what would happen on a phone. We have infogram and Venngage scaled down. All right, I am going to wind this up.
Thanks, Jim. I just have a quick question from Ian Caldwell, who wondered about interactivity when you're moving between websites, mobiles, tablets, and so on. He says he's had some problems with interactive annual reports that lost interactivity when moving between different devices. Can you make any comment about that?
To be honest with you, like coding those things is not actually my, it's not actually really in my purview. I'm a graphic designer, so I make things look good. And then when I am building interactive things, I would work with a developer who knows all about the coding aspects and how to build that. Now, there are pieces of interactivity that work better on desktop and don't necessarily work that well on phones. For example, hovering over things. In touch devices, that's not possible because the touch device doesn't know where your finger is if you're hovering over the surface. So it only works with contact interactivity. There are ways around that, but it needs to be built in such a way that the device is going to, the visualization or the interactive annual report, for example, understands what it's being viewed on or accommodates for it initially so that we don't build necessarily hover interactivity into it, for example. Or maybe it looks at it and goes, you know what, I know that I'm being viewed on iOS, and so actually instead of hover, we're going to transfer that over to a click interactivity. There's not really a hard and fast way that I can explain to you how to make that happen. That would be something that you would need to work with your web developer if you were building something like that. Now, these particular interactivities that I've shown you today, they're inherent from the tool that we've decided to use. So I don't really have too much in the way of input into what those interactivities are. They're just what they give me based on the tool. Does that answer the question, do you think?
I think that was helpful. Thanks, Jim. Related to that, there's a second question. I realize we're running out of time, but I wonder if I could put it to you. A few people have asked about using the same infographic for multiple purposes. This is something I've had problems with at Future Earth. For example, if we develop something that's intended to be published in a magazine, and then we think it would be nice to put this online afterwards, it can be quite difficult to get something that works well for both formats. Can you make any suggestions on how to get around that? Is it something that you really need to know about at the start? And are there any platforms that are particularly good for making infographics that work on in different formats?
Well, I guess it's a great question. And earlier in the presentation, when I was talking about understanding the medium that we're going to use to deliver the infographic, I guess that's what I was getting at. It is possible to repurpose that content into a different medium, but in some cases what you're actually doing is building a second infographic. In the past, for example, some of the infographics we built for C4, we've actually intentionally built them in a kind of modular fashion, and the kind of cover image for this webinar was an infographic that we built about mangroves, and it was kind of five reasons mangroves are important for Indonesia. And we built that in a fashion that had these kind of smaller segments inside the infographic. And what that allowed us to do was then we kind of cropped into that infographic, and we had then Instagram shareable posts that were legible in that environment. that then linked to this deeper content, this big long infographic. And we thought about that when we were actually building the thing. And I guess it's really important that you kind of think about that before you start. In terms of an easy way to make that happen, I can't actually give you any tips on that. It is a constant difficulty. And actually, really, what you'll need to throw at it is time and energy. Using those different tools that we've used today, as you saw, a lot of them probably don't allow you to create an infographic for print unless you pay, which is to say that you can build it, but you probably can't download it in a high-res format enough that you can, print it. There are ways around that. That little cheat that I showed you before for the Google Sheets, printing it from inside Chrome as a PDF does work for some of those other options. But I'm not 100% certain if doing that violates the kind of user agreement that you sign up to. So you need to be careful with that. Yeah, I think that, look, oftentimes you're going to end up building two. It's the same thinking, but what you need to do then is kind of relay it out. But all that hard thinking that you do at the start about how to actually codify your message, how to prioritize those pieces of information, I mean, that's all the same. It's really just a matter of moving those blocks around that you create. And that will take time, but that's probably the only way around it. Any other questions hiding behind there, Lizzie, before I start talking about the next webinar?
Thanks, Jim. We've got some more questions, but as we're quite late on time now, I'd suggest we perhaps hold those for the next webinar, or we can continue the discussion on Twitter using the pop-up webinars hashtag. And some of those questions are about privacy of data when you're using public free services like Tableau Public, and about what makes a good design. It's a huge question. Maybe people could share some ideas using Twitter, and we can bring those to the follow-up webinar next time.
That's great, and I appreciate that. Actually, what we've done today is kind of go through and look at all the different ways that you can build things. And I haven't given you any tips on using your text and your color effectively, and that's actually what I want to talk about next. So we've got a follow-up webinar which is on the 28th. I think is that correct, Lizzie? The 28th of October. At the same time for Europe, but actually because Europe comes off summertime, it'll be an hour earlier for other people. And what I'm hoping to address in that is a little more actually practically when you're building it, things to think about, how you might wish to use color, what that's a powerful tool for, and things to avoid. So between now and then, if you'd like, we invite you to take a blog post or paper of yours, or perhaps something else that's come across your desk, and using one or more of these different tools, turn it into some kind of snappy infographic or visualization. And if you can send it to the email address on your screen now, what we'll do is look at the sort of first 15 that we receive, and we'll give you some personal feedback about what we think about it in terms of its messaging and its layout. And I appreciate that we haven't actually covered a ton of this stuff yet, but in an hour, I'm hoping that you can appreciate that there's a lot of ground to cover, and that it's kind of difficult for me to distill 10 years worth of design practice into an hour seminar. There's also a chance that your content will be featured on Future Earth, so that's great to get your messaging out there. But if you like, and building an infographic is biting off more than you can chew, maybe investigate some of those single chart options that I showed you, and just kind of look at, maybe how you can embed maps or infographics or charts into an existing blog post of yours to really just make the visual aspect of it come to life. So here's the details for the follow-up webinar. I've got a short link there to the sign-up page, just because I'm not sure you can actually click on that in any easy way. So that's a nice little short link for you. What I'm hoping to do in that follow-up webinar is maybe give you, if we have time, depending on your feedback from this one and the things that you'd like to cover, I was thinking I might actually go through one of my own designs and maybe take you into the background of it, and so you can see the sorts of things that we've got from scientists, and how we ended up translating that through. And I've got a couple of these case studies where I can show you some work in progress things, so you can see some of the things that we looked at and decided, we don't like that, or things that we decided to change. I'm hoping we'll have a chance to review and, if you'll allow us, to critique some of your infographics in a constructive fashion, maybe give you some tips and feedback on how to make them better. And I guess the big one for you guys is the practical design tips and tricks, including hopefully covering some ideas about which charts are good to use for which types of data, how to use color, how to use text, and what I think is really important is how to use space in your design. If you missed the previous Future Earth pop-up webinars, there's a link there that you can go to and have a look at them. There's some great content in there as well. That's it from me today. Apologies for going over time, and I hope you've stayed with us. Let me turn off my screen sharing. So thanks very much for joining us, and I hope we'll see a lot of you back here. Now, Lizzie, I know that this is streaming directly up to YouTube, and we'll have we will have the slides actually up on SlideShare so that you can click through at your own time, in your own leisure, so that you're not just rocketing through them like we did today, and investigate some of those tools yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining, everyone. See you next time.